You think a signature on a piece of paper makes you a rancher? Victor Hargrove's voice was low, like the rumble of distant thunder, but his words hit Olita Moffat like a physical blow. He leaned forward in his saddle, a towering silhouette against the harsh Wyoming sun. Out here, Miss Moffat, the land doesn't respect ink. It respects strength. It respects blood. And you, he sneered, his gaze sweeping over her dusty but still too fine traveling dress, you're just passing through. But Olita Moffat didn't flinch. Not a single inch. There was fresh dirt on her boots from the soil she now owned. There was a smear of blood on her sleeve from a barbed wire fence his men had cut just that morning. And clutched in her hand, there was a deed. A simple piece of paper with Buford Kincheloh's signature, yes. But it was more than that. It was a promise. It was a claim. It was a declaration of war. I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Hargrove, she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tense silence of the main street. Not until you explain why your men burned my fence and put your brand on my cattle. The air crackled. The two young men flanking Hargrove, his sons, shifted in their saddles, their hands drifting instinctively toward their holsters. The whole town of Sweetwater seemed to be holding its breath, watching from behind dusty window panes and saloon doors. They all thought they knew how this story ended. They were wrong, because what was about to happen would shake the entire county to its very foundations. Olita Moffat wasn't just some mail-order bride who'd stumbled into the wrong fight. She was the legal owner of the very empire that was trying to erase her from the map. And when the whole ugly truth finally crawled out into the light, someone was going to lose everything. If you believe that respect isn't earned through threats or power, but through pure, unyielding grit, if you believe in truth and justice, no matter the cost, then click that subscribe button, type justice in the comments below, and tell us where you're watching from. Now let's ride. The stagecoach wheel dropped into another rut with a violent crash that felt like the world was cracking open. Olita Moffat's hatbox flew from the seat beside her, and she lunged, catching it just an inch from the muddy, spit-stained floor. She clutched it to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs, and carefully placed it back on the worn leather seat. The journey from Philadelphia had been a special kind of hell. First, the endless click-clack of the train as it crawled across the vast, empty canvas of America. Now, this bone-jarring, gut-wrenching stagecoach for the final leg into the Wyoming territory. It felt less like a journey and more like a punishment. First time out west, ma'am? The voice came from the man seated across from her. He was a kindly-looking fellow, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and wind, but his eyes twinkled with a genuine warmth that was the first she'd felt in weeks. Olita just nodded, trying to tuck a stray lock of dark hair back into her once-perfect chignon. It was a hopeless battle against the dust and the wind. Is it that obvious? He offered a gentle, toothy smile. Most folks round here don't bother with fancy traveling suits, he said, gesturing to her deep blue wool ensemble. Too much dust and too many bumps for that kind of thing. At 32, Olita had long resigned herself to the quiet, predictable life of a spinster. The war had stolen a generation of young men, and her position as a respected school teacher in Philadelphia offered a comfortable security, but little in the way of passion or promise. Her world was one of chalk dust, quiet libraries, and the polite, stifling society of the East. Then Buford Kincheloh's letters began to arrive. His words, written in a strong, flowing hand, painted a picture of a different world, a world of wide-open skies, of building something real and lasting with your own two hands. He wrote of his ranch, the Active Chem, not as a business, but as a living, breathing dream. He spoke of loneliness, of a desire for a partner to share it all with. And in Olita, something she thought had long since withered away began to stir. Hope, a dangerous, fragile thing. Sweetwater, coming up! The driver's voice bellowed from outside, yanking Olita from her daydream. The stagecoach groaned and swayed as it slowed, finally rolling to a stop before a plain wooden building. A sign painted in large, slightly crooked letters read, Dobbins General Store and Post Office. This was it, the start of her new life. The driver opened the door and offered a hand. Olita took it, her legs feeling unsteady as she stepped down onto the main street of Sweetwater. It was hardly a street at all, just a single wide path of churned mud, lined with a handful of raw, unpainted wooden buildings. It was a world away from the bustling, cobblestone avenues of Philadelphia. It was raw, untamed, and for a terrifying second, she felt a wave of regret so powerful it almost buckled her knees. "Miss Moffat?" A man approached, tall and thin, with spectacles perched on his nose. He removed his hat, revealing a balding head. His eyes were kind, but the somber, almost pained expression on his face sent a sudden, icy chill straight through her. "Yes, that's me," she replied, her voice sounding small. She extended a gloved hand. "Merle Dobbins, ma'am," he said, taking her hand for a brief, nervous shake. He wouldn't meet her eyes, instead twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "I own the general store, and I serve as postmaster." He paused, took a deep breath, and the next words came out in a low, reluctant rush. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news for you." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The sounds of the street faded to a dull roar in her ears. She could feel the stares of the few people milling about. Their curiosity piqued. "Is it Buford?" she managed to whisper, her throat suddenly tight and dry. "Is he ill?" Dobbins glanced around nervously, as if the very air had ears. He lowered his voice even further. "Perhaps we should speak inside, Miss Moffat, in my office." She followed him into the dim, cluttered interior of the general store, her legs moving on their own accord, feeling like they were made of lead. The air inside smelled of coffee, leather, and something else, the faint, cloying scent of trouble. While he bustled around a small stove to prepare tea, Olita sank into a chair, trying desperately to calm her racing heart. It was a misunderstanding. It had to be. Perhaps Buford had been called away on business, a cattle drive. Maybe there had been some trouble at the ranch, a fire or a flood. Any explanation was better than the one she saw taking shape in the postmaster's worried eyes. Dobbins returned with two steaming cups and sat across from her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man delivering a death sentence. He finally looked her straight in the eye. "Miss Moffat," he began, his voice heavy with regret, "I am deeply sorry to have to be the one to tell you this. Mr. Buford Kincheloe, he is currently being held at the Wyoming Territorial Prison in Laramie." The teacup trembled in her hand, rattling against the saucer. The sound was unnaturally loud in the sudden, deafening silence of the small office. Prison. The word didn't make sense. It was an alien concept, something from a penny dreadful novel, not something connected to the kind, honorable man from the letters. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. "No mistake, ma'am," Dobbins said softly. "He was convicted 3 months ago for cattle rustling." Cattle rustling? The accusation was so absurd, so utterly preposterous, that a small, hysterical laugh escaped her lips. She quickly stifled it, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's impossible. Buford owns one of the largest ranches in the territory, the Active K. Why on earth would he steal cattle from someone else?" "That's what a lot of folks are still wondering," Dobbins admitted, leaning forward. "There are whispers. Those who believe he was framed by the Hargrove outfit, Victor Hargrove and his sons. They've been trying to get their hands on Kincheloe's land for years, especially since the railroad announced it was planning to expand through these parts. Good land with water rights is about to become more valuable than gold." Before Alita could process this new, dizzying piece of information, a thought struck her, sharp and painful. Did he know I was coming? Did he try to send word to stop me? "He tried," Dobbins said, his expression softening with pity. He reached into a drawer in his desk and retrieved a familiar-looking envelope. "This arrived last week, but you were already on your way. The Postal Service isn't exactly swift out here in the territory." Alita took the letter, her fingers trembling so badly she could barely hold it. Her name was written on the front in that strong, flowing script she had come to cherish, a script that now seemed like a relic from a different lifetime. "You must have family back east you can return to," Dobbins suggested gently, his voice full of concern. The question landed like a punch to the gut, bringing the full, crushing weight of her situation crashing down on her. Her teaching position in Philadelphia had been filled the day she left. She had sold most of her possessions to finance this journey, to buy her wedding dress and the small household items she'd planned to bring to her new home. Her parents were long gone, and her only sister had moved to California years ago, their correspondence infrequent at best. She was utterly and completely alone. "No," she said, the word barely audible. "There is nothing for me to return to." Before Dobbins could offer another word of sympathy, the front door of the store burst open, and the sound of raised, angry voices spilled into the back office. "You think you can just swoop in and take Kinchelo's land now that he's locked up?" A man shouted, his voice raw with fury. "The bank has first claim, Hollifield, and don't you forget it." Another, colder voice answered, "That ranch is mortgaged up to its eyeballs. Without Kinchelo, it's forfeit." Dobbins sighed and shook his head, looking exhausted. "I do apologize for this display, Miss Moffat. As you can probably gather, Mr. Kinchelo's imprisonment has created some complications for the active K." "Who are those men?" Olita asked, her senses suddenly sharp, her fear beginning to curdle into a cold, hard knot of anger. "The angry one is Rule Hollifield. He's Buford's foreman. Loyal to a fault," Dobbins explained. "The other is Claudel Hightower. He runs the bank here in Sweetwater, and he's got a stake in seeing the active K fail." Alone again in the small office, the shouting match in the main store providing a chaotic backdrop, Olita finally broke the seal on Buford's letter. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird as she unfolded the single sheet of paper. "My dearest Olita, by the time you receive this, you may already be on your way west, and for that, I am more sorry than words can ever express. It is my deepest regret that my troubles have found their way to you. I have been convicted of a crime I did not commit. Victor Hargrove and his sons have long coveted my land, and they have finally found a way to take it, by framing me for cattle rustling with the help of liars and a corrupt court. I cannot ask you to tie your life to this mess, to a convicted man. I release you from any and all obligation you might feel toward me. Please return to your life in Philadelphia and forget you ever heard the name Buford Kinchelo. With profound regret and enduring affection, Buford." She read the letter twice, then a third time. He was releasing her, telling her to run. But as she folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her reticule, something inside her shifted. It wasn't just hope that had been stirred by his letters. It was a fighting spirit she hadn't known she possessed. They had taken this man's freedom, his reputation, and his land. They had tried to take her future. They would not succeed. She stood up, her back straight, her resolve hardening like steel. She stepped out of the office and into the main room of the general store. The argument had ended, but the tension was so thick you could taste it. In one corner, a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark, unruly hair and a worn leather vest was pretending to examine a ledger. But his knuckles were white where he gripped the counter. His whole body radiated a coiled, restless anger. He looked up as she approached, and his eyes, a startlingly intense shade of blue, narrowed. "Miss Moffat?" he asked, his voice the same raw, furious one she'd heard moments before. "Yes," she said, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "And you must be Mr. Hollifield, Buford's foreman." He gave a curt nod. "Rule Hollifield, I was hoping to meet you under better circumstances." His eyes were wary, assessing her. He was probably expecting tears, a swoon, a ticket on the next stagecoach east. "You believe Buford was framed," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. His jaw tightened. "I don't believe it, ma'am. I know it," he said, his voice a low growl. "I was right there at the ranch house with him the night they claimed he was out stealing Hargrove cattle. We were going over the books, trying to figure out how to make the next payment to Hightower's bank. But my word wasn't enough. Not against the 3 hired guns the Hargroves paid to swear they saw him cutting their fence." A sudden clear purpose formed in Olita's mind, cutting through the fog of shock and grief. "I'd like to see the ranch, Mr. Hollifield," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. He looked surprised. "Ma'am?" "And," she added, her voice gaining strength, "I'd like to visit Buford, as soon as it can be arranged." Hollifield stared at her for a long moment, a flicker of something, respect perhaps, dawning in his guarded eyes. "The prison's a hard 2-day ride to Laramie," he said slowly. "As for the ranch, I can take you out there now if you'd like." He hesitated, then added, "But you should know, Miss Moffat, it's not what it once was. The Hargroves, they haven't been gentle." He paused, a strange look crossing his face. "Buford. He had the main house built special. For you." The wagon crested a hill, and the active K ranch emerged from behind a stand of whispering pines. Olita caught her breath, a gasp that was part awe and part sorrow. Even with Hollifield's warning, the property was breathtaking. A sprawling main house stood proudly at its center, though one entire wing was a blackened, charred skeleton of timber, a stark and ugly wound. Beyond it stood several outbuildings, large barns, and sturdy-looking corrals. And past it all, rolling grasslands stretched to the feet of the distant purple mountains, a sea of green and gold under the impossibly vast sky. "It's beautiful," she whispered, the word inadequate. "It was Buford's whole world," Hollifield replied, his voice rough with emotion. 15,000 acres. Good water, fine grazing land. Took him 10 years to build it up from nothing, with just his own 2 hands and a hell of a lot of stubbornness. As their wagon drew near the main house, an older woman emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. She was perhaps 60, with iron gray hair pulled back into a severe bun, and a face so stern it looked as if it had been carved from granite, suggesting she smiled rarely, if ever. "That's Zora Faircloth," Hollifield explained in a low voice. "Came with the land, practically. Best cook in 3 counties and loyal to Buford to the bone. Don't mind her bark. Her bite is worse, but only for them that deserve it." The interior of the house was another surprise. Despite the shocking fire damage to the east wing, the main rooms were furnished with an unexpected elegance. Quality furniture, polished hardwood floors that gleamed even in the dusty afternoon light, and touches of refinement that spoke of a world far from Sweetwater. A handsome piano stood in one corner of the parlor. Bookshelves lined an entire wall, filled with leather-bound volumes of Shakespeare, Dickens, and Emerson. Zora, who had greeted them with a grunt and a suspicious glare, seemed to soften slightly at Olita's visible surprise. "Mr. Buford had it all brought in from Denver last fall," she explained, her voice as raspy as dry leaves. "Said a lady from the East, a schoolteacher, would be expecting certain comforts. Said this house was to be a queen's castle." The words hung in the air, a testament to a future that had been stolen. Olita felt a fresh pang of loss, so sharp it almost made her double over. This was supposed to have been her home. Later, drawn by an unseen force, she found herself in Buford's study. It was a masculine space smelling of leather, tobacco, and old paper. A desk of solid oak dominated the room. Papers were neatly arranged, and ledgers were stacked in one corner. It was the desk of a man who was meticulous, organized, and in control, not the desk of a common thief. She ran her fingers over the smooth, cool wood, trying to feel some connection to the man she had only known through his words. As she examined the papers more closely, her eyes caught the edge of a different kind of document. A thicker, more official-looking paper, partially hidden beneath a stack of ledgers. Curiosity piqued, she pulled it out carefully. Her breath hitched in her throat. It was a deed, an official, stamped and notarized deed from the Wyoming Territorial Land Office. It detailed in precise legal language the transfer of ownership for the entire 15,000-acre active K ranch, transferred to one Olita Moffat of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The signature at the bottom was unmistakably Buford's, witnessed by 2 other men. And the date, it was dated just 1 week before his arrest. Her mind reeled. She wasn't a jilted mail-order bride. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't a charity case. She was the owner. "Mr. Hollifield," she called out, her voice barely a whisper, trembling with the force of the revelation. He appeared in the doorway a moment later, his expression questioning. "Ma'am?" She held up the deed, her hands shaking so much the paper rattled. "Did you know about this?" Hollifield's eyes widened as he stepped forward and took the document from her. He read it quickly, his lips moving silently. Then he read it again, slower this time. A low whistle escaped his lips. Well, I'll be damned, he breathed, looking from the deed to Alita and back again. Buford never mentioned a word of this to me. He examined the witness signatures at the bottom carefully. These witnesses, I know 'em. Tom Bradley and Pete Sampson. Worked on the Miller place north of here. Honest men, both of 'em, solid as rock. He looked up at her, and the wary, assessing look was gone from his eyes. It was replaced by a dawning, ferocious light, a glimmer of a new, unexpected battle plan. This means I'm the legal owner of this ranch, Alita said slowly, the full, staggering implications of the document finally settling upon her. Holofield handed the deed back to her, his movements reverent. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. Yes, ma'am, he said, his voice a low, satisfied growl. That's exactly what it means. And that, Miss Moffat, that changes everything. The very next morning, Olita rode into Sweetwater with Rule Holofield at her side. The deed was wrapped in oilcloth and tucked securely into her saddlebags. It felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Word of her arrival, and her decision to stay, had apparently spread through the small town like a prairie fire. Curious eyes followed them from every doorway and window as they made their way down the muddy main street. They weren't just staring at the woman from the east anymore. They were staring at the new owner of the Active K. Their first stop was the bank. Claudel Hightower was waiting for them behind his large, imposing desk, his face a mask of smug disapproval. He didn't bother to rise when they entered. Miss Moffat, he said, his voice dripping with condescension, I trust Mr. Holofield has shown you the reality of the situation. I understand you'll be booking passage on the next stagecoach east. Actually, Mr. Hightower, Olita replied, her own voice surprisingly calm and even, I'm here to discuss the ranch's financial obligations. She walked directly to his desk, pulled the deed from her bag, and laid it flat on the polished wood between them. As the legal owner, Hightower's face went slack, his condescending smirk melting away as he read the document. His complexion turned a pale, pasty white, as if he'd seen a ghost. He picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly, holding it up to the light as if to check for forgery. This is impossible, he stammered, his eyes darting from the deed to Alita. Kinchelo never mentioned any such transfer. Perhaps because he knew you'd try to contest it, Olita countered smoothly, feeling a surge of confidence she hadn't known she possessed. He knew men like you and Hargrove would circle like vultures the second he was out of the way. This was his insurance policy. I'll need to have my attorney examine this, Hightower sputtered, his voice tight with fury as he struggled to regain his composure. This is highly irregular. You do that, Olita said, turning to leave. In the meantime, I will be taking over all operations at the Active K, and you will address all future correspondence regarding the ranch directly to me. Good day, Mr. Hightower. As they stepped back out into the bright sunlight, Holofield let out a short, sharp laugh of pure admiration. Ma'am, you just made a mortal enemy of the second most powerful man in the county. Olita squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of the fight ahead. Who's the first? As if on cue, Holofield's expression hardened. Speak of the devil, he muttered under his breath. Victor Hargrove, and he's coming this way. 3 riders were approaching from the far end of the street, moving with an unhurried, arrogant swagger that seemed to demand the right of way. The man in the middle was tall and imposing, even from a distance, with silver-streaked dark hair and an expensive suit that looked out of place in the dusty town. He was flanked by 2 younger men, both of whom bore a striking, brutish resemblance to him. His sons. They reined in their horses directly in front of Olita and Holofield, blocking their path. Miss Moffat, Victor Hargrove said, his voice a silky, dangerous purr. He tipped his fine black hat with an exaggerated, mocking courtesy. I hear you're laying claim to the Kinchelo property. A bold move for a woman in your delicate position. I'm not claiming anything, Mr. Hargrove, Olita said, her heart hammering, but her voice steady. I am the owner. It's all there in black and white at the land office. Paper can burn, Hargrove said, his smile never reaching his cold, dead eyes. His tone hardened, the thin veneer of civility vanishing. And that's a matter of some dispute. I should warn you, Ranching out here is dangerous work. Accidents happen all the time. Fences get cut, barns catch fire, especially to folks who don't understand the territory, folks who don't belong. The threat was unmistakable, hanging in the air between them like a coiled rattlesnake. Is that a threat, Mr. Hargrove? Olita asked, refusing to back down, refusing to show the fear that was churning in her stomach. Just some friendly advice, Hargrove replied with a cold, predatory smile. This isn't Philadelphia, Miss Moffat. Out here the strong survive, and the weak, well, they usually just disappear. He gave a slight nod to his sons, and the three of them spurred their horses, riding past so close that Olita was forced to take a step back to avoid being trampled. The confrontation left her shaken, but more determined than ever. That evening, back at the ranch, a sense of urgency propelled her back to Buford's study. If the deed had been hidden, what else might be? She searched the room more thoroughly this time, running her hands along the bookshelves, checking beneath the rug, tapping on the wooden wall panels. Finally, her fingers found a small, almost invisible latch on the side of the large oak desk. She pressed it. With a soft click, a secret compartment slid open. Inside, nestled amongst a few spare account books, was a small, leather-bound journal and several rolled-up maps, tied with twine. Her hands trembled as she opened the journal. Buford's familiar script filled the pages, but this was not the writing of a hopeful man courting a future bride. This was the writing of a man at war. The journal was a meticulous record of the past year. It detailed strange cattle movements near the Hargrove property line, suspicious fires that had plagued smaller, independent ranchers who refused to sell out to Hargrove, and a pattern of intimidation tactics that had driven half a dozen families from the valley. He wrote of his growing certainty that he was being targeted, that Hargrove was trying to force him out. Then she unrolled the maps. They were survey maps, showing the proposed route for the new railroad expansion, and it ran directly through the heart of the active K, right through its best grazing land, and most importantly, right across its primary water source, Sweetwater Creek. The railroad, she murmured aloud, a horrifying understanding dawning on her. That's what this has all been about. Owning this land meant controlling the railroad's access. It was a fortune far greater than any herd of cattle could represent. Ma'am, you say something? Hollifield's voice came from the doorway. He had been quietly keeping watch from the porch since their return from town. She showed him the maps, her finger tracing the proposed route. The railroad is planned to go right through our best grazing land, Rule, right over the creek. Hollifield's face went grim as he studied the map. I'll be damned. That would make this property the most valuable piece of land in the entire territory, he said, his voice low. More valuable than cattle, more valuable than gold. No wonder the Hargroves wanted Buford out of the way. With him gone, and the bank foreclosing, they could have snapped it up for pennies on the dollar. There's more, Olita said, her voice tight. She opened the journal to a specific entry, one that had made her blood run cold. She read it aloud. Hargrove has everyone in his pocket. I suspect he even has his own brother, Judge Lawrence Hargrove, doing his bidding from the bench. I fear I will not get a fair trial if it comes to that. The law in Sweetwater is whatever Victor Hargrove says it is. Hollifield let out a string of curses under his breath. Judge Hargrove is Victor's brother, he said, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. He's been on the bench for 20 years. No wonder Buford got such a harsh sentence on such flimsy evidence. The whole damn system is rigged. A heavy silence fell over the room, the weight of the conspiracy pressing down on them. They weren't just fighting a greedy rancher anymore. They were fighting the law itself. 3 days later, Olita made the arduous journey to the Wyoming Territorial Prison in Laramie. The prison was a fortress-like structure of gray stone that loomed against the vast prairie sky, a brutal monument to despair. The air inside was cold and smelled of disinfectant and hopelessness. She waited in a small, stark visiting room until a set of heavy iron doors clanged open, and the guards brought in a man she had never seen before, yet somehow recognized instantly from the small photograph he had sent her. Buford Kincheloe was tall and lean, with the kind eyes she remembered from the picture, though they were now shadowed with weariness and disbelief. He moved with a quiet dignity that his drab prison garb could not diminish. When he saw her, his eyes lit up, and for a moment the weight of the prison seemed to fall away from him. "Miss Moffat, Olita," he said, his voice breaking slightly. I told you not to come." "I don't take orders well, Mr. Kincheloe," she replied, surprised by her own boldness. A small smile touched her lips. They sat across from each other at a rough-hewn wooden table, the space between them charged with 1,000 unspoken words. She saw in his face the honorable man from the letters, but she also saw the toll his ordeal had taken. "I found the deed," she said finally, getting straight to the point. A wave of profound relief washed over his features. "Thank God," he breathed. "I was afraid they might have found it and destroyed it in the fire." "Why didn't you tell me about it in your letters? Why keep it a secret?" "Because I hoped to God I'd be proven innocent before you ever arrived," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I didn't want you bound to a convicted felon, tied to a losing fight. I wanted to give you a clean way out." "Buford," she said, leaning forward, her voice low and intense, "I believe you're innocent, and I have no intention of taking the way out. I intend to prove it." His eyes widened, a new fear dawning in them, not for himself, but for her. "Olita, you don't understand what you're up against. The Hargroves have money, influence. They have the law on their side. They are not afraid to use violence to get what they want. They've already tried to burn down the house twice." "Then you'll have to teach me how to fight back," she said simply. Her resolve was absolute. This was her fight now, too. "There were witnesses to the supposed rustling," Buford continued, his mind racing. "3 drifters who worked for the Hargroves for a few weeks. They provided the testimony that convicted me. I'd never seen them before, and they vanished right after the trial. If you could find them, get them to tell the truth." "I'll find them," she promised, her voice ringing with a certainty that surprised them both. "I will find them, Buford, whatever it takes." The ride back from Laramie was tense. Olita wasn't alone this time. Holofield had insisted on accompanying her, along with 2 of the most loyal ranch hands from the active K. Silent, weathered men who had worked for Buford for years and trusted Holofield implicitly. They rode hard, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon, a shared sense of paranoia hanging over them. On the second day, as they crested a low hill overlooking the sprawling valley that led back toward Sweetwater, Holofield suddenly reined in his horse, his body going rigid. "Riders," he said, his voice a low growl. He pointed to a rising dust cloud in the distance. "And they're moving fast." "How many?" Olita asked, her hand instinctively going to the small pistol Buford had insisted she learn to use, which now rested in her saddlebag. "4, maybe 5, Holofield answered, his eyes narrowed. "Too many for a simple patrol." They spurred their horses, leaving the main trail and taking cover behind a cluster of large granite boulders, watching as the riders approached. Olita's heart hammered against her ribs. She recognized 2 of them instantly, Luke and Matthew Hargrove, Victor's arrogant sons. The others were strangers, hard-looking men with their guns tied down low on their hips, the kind of men who sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. "They're not heading for town," Holofield said grimly, watching their trajectory. "They're heading straight for the ranch." "Then we'd better get there first," Olita replied, a cold dread washing over her. She kicked her horse into a gallop, the others following close behind, racing across the open prairie in a desperate attempt to cut them off. They were too late. As they thundered over the final rise, they saw it. A thick column of black smoke was billowing into the clear blue sky, rising from the active K, from the main house. They arrived to a scene of chaos. The entire eastern wing, the section that had already been damaged, was now fully engulfed in flames. Zora Faircloth stood in the yard, her stern face streaked with soot and tears, wringing her hands as she watched the fire consume what was left of the wing Buford had built for his bride. "They came just after dawn," she cried as Olita and the men dismounted, their faces grim. "The Hargrove boys and their hired thugs said they were checking for squatters. Next thing I knew, the whole east wing was ablaze. They just sat on their horses and watched it burn." "Was anyone hurt?" Olita asked, her first thought for the cook and the few hands who remained at the ranch. "No," Zora said, her voice shaking with rage. They made sure we were all out. But they made it clear this was just the beginning. Matthew Hargrove, he told me to tell the new owner that the next fire would take the whole damn place, with all of us inside. The threat was a chilling promise, but the next morning brought something even worse. A new front in the war that Olita hadn't anticipated. A wagon rattled up the lane, carrying Claudel Hightower, the town sheriff, a portly, indecisive man named Brennan, and, to Olita's shock, Matthew Hargrove, who was smirking with undisguised triumph. Sheriff Brennan shuffled his feet awkwardly, avoiding her gaze as he handed her a legal document. It was a warrant for her arrest. "On what charges?" Olita demanded, her voice incredulous as she read the warrant. "Fraud? Forgery? This is ridiculous. The deed is legal. I have witnesses to its authenticity." "Funny thing about that, ma'am," the sheriff said apologetically, his eyes pleading for her to understand he was just doing his job. "Your witnesses, Tom Bradley and Pete Sampson? They can't be found. Packed up and left the territory last week, according to their neighbors." "And," Matthew Hargrove interjected, stepping forward with a swagger, "I saw you with my own two eyes. I saw you forging documents in the ranch house study just yesterday morning." "That's impossible," Olita shot back, her head spinning. "I was in Laramie yesterday, visiting Buford at the prison. You know that." "That's what you claim," Matthew sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. "But I saw what I saw. A desperate woman trying to forge a claim to a ranch that isn't hers." Olita looked at the faces surrounding her. The sheriff's weak-willed regret, Hightower's cold satisfaction, Matthew's smug hatred. A few of her own ranch hands had gathered, their expressions a mixture of confusion and anger. "This is a frame-up," she said, her voice ringing out across the yard. "It's another lie, just like the ones you told to put an innocent man in prison." "Ma'am," the sheriff said gently, taking a step forward, "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." "No." The word was a flat, hard command. Rule Holofield stepped forward, placing himself between Olita and the sheriff. His hand was resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "This is wrong, Sheriff Brennan," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And you know it is. I've got my orders, Rule. A sworn statement from an eyewitness. Then you'll have to go through me to carry them out." For a long, heart-stopping moment, the yard was silent save for the crackle of the still smoldering fire. The tension was a living thing, a spark away from exploding into violence. Then a new voice cut through the standoff. "Sheriff!" Everyone turned. Julene Bister, the town's freight hauler, a tough, no-nonsense woman known for speaking her mind, stepped out of the crowd that had begun to gather at the end of the lane. "I was here," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I was delivering supplies to the Active K yesterday morning. Miss Moffat wasn't here. She was already on the road to Laramie, left before sunup. Zora here can attest to it." "That's impossible," Matthew Hargrove snarled, his face turning red. "I saw her clear as day." "Then you either saw a ghost or you're a liar, Matthew Hargrove," Julene replied calmly, folding her arms across her chest. "And we all know which one of those is more likely." The crowd murmured. The sheriff looked confused, his already weak resolve crumbling. In the sudden confusion, as Hightower and Matthew began arguing with Julene, Holofield grabbed Olita's arm. "We need to go," he hissed. "Now." He pulled her toward the stables where two horses were already saddled. Before the sheriff or the Hargroves could react, they were mounted and riding hard, thundering out of the ranch yard and heading for the rugged, concealing hills. Behind them, shouts of anger and surprise erupted as their escape was discovered. They were officially fugitives. "Where can we possibly go?" Olita shouted over the sound of the pounding hooves as they paused to rest their heaving horses in a rocky canyon miles from the ranch. They were on the run, hunted by a corrupt lawman in a powerful, ruthless family. "There's an old line shack up in the mountains," Holofield replied, his face grim, his eyes scanning their back trail. "It's not much, but it's hidden. We can hole up there, figure out our next move." The shack was little more than 4 crumbling walls and a leaky roof, but it offered shelter from the biting wind that had begun to howl down from the high peaks. As night fell, Olita sat by the small, sputtering fire they had managed to build, staring into the mesmerizing flames. the full weight of her desperate situation threatening to crush her. She was a wanted woman, accused of a crime she didn't commit, fighting for a man who was already in prison, for a ranch that was being systematically destroyed. "I'm sorry," Hollifield said quietly from the other side of the fire. His usual anger had been replaced by a deep, weary sadness. This, this isn't what Buford wanted for you." Olita looked up from the flames, her eyes reflecting the firelight. The fear and despair of the past few days had been burned away, leaving behind something harder, something forged in the heat of injustice. "What Buford wanted was his life back," she replied, her voice low and steady. "He wanted justice, and that's exactly what I intend to get for him." The next morning, just as the sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the rugged landscape, a lone rider approached the shack. It was Julene Bister, leading a pack mule laden with supplies. "The whole town's buzzing," she said as she dismounted, wasting no time on pleasantries. "Half the folks think you're a cunning fraud, just like the Hargroves are saying. The other half think you're getting a raw deal. The battle lines are being drawn." She paused, a wry smile touching her lips. "But I brought someone who might just tip the scales in your favor." She gestured toward the trees, and a man emerged from the shadows. He was weathered and grizzled, with the haunted look of someone who had seen too much and had been running for a long time. His eyes were sharp and missed nothing. "Name's Calloway," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I used to haul freight through these parts a long time ago. Jeline here says you're looking for witnesses connected to that cattle-rustling frame-up." "You know something about it?" Olita asked, her heart beginning to beat faster. "I know those 3 drifters who testified against Kincheloe," Calloway said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "Saw them up in Montana last month, bragging in a saloon about how they'd earned a fat purse for a bit of creative storytelling down in Wyoming. Thing is, I also know their faces from a different place." He paused for effect. "From a wanted poster. They're wanted for a bank robbery up in the Dakota Territory." Olita felt a jolt of electricity run through her. This was it, a crack in the Hargroves' wall of lies. "You're certain?" "Certain enough to swear to it in a court of law," Calloway said. He then looked at her, his expression grim. "Trouble is, Miss Moffat, there ain't no honest court in this county, not as long as Judge Hargrove is on the bench." "Then we won't use his court," Olita said, a bold, desperate plan forming in her mind. "We'll have to go over his head." "To who?" Hollifield asked, skeptical. "To the territorial governor," Olita declared, "and to someone even higher." It was the longest of long shots, a desperate gamble against a stacked deck, but it was the only shot they had. They rode for Laramie that very day, a strange, determined posse of fugitives and truth-tellers. Olita, the refined schoolteacher turned rancher. Holifield, the fiery foreman seeking vengeance. Julene, the steadfast freighter who refused to bow to intimidation. And Calloway, the grizzled ghost from the past with a story to tell. At the prison, they didn't just meet with Buford. They met with the warden, laying out their entire case on his desk. Buford's journal, the railroad maps, and Calloway's bombshell testimony about the wanted witnesses. The warden, a stern but fair-minded man, listened intently, his expression growing more and more serious as he studied the documents and heard their story. "This is a serious and disturbing accusation," he said slowly, looking at Olita with new respect. "If what you're saying is true, we may very well have an innocent man behind these walls, and the entire legal system of Sweetwater County is corrupt." "There's more," Olita said, her confidence growing. She pulled out a letter she had written in secret weeks ago, a letter she had sent with a trusted traveler heading east. "While investigating Buford's affairs, I discovered he had a brother-in-law, a man he hadn't spoken to in years due to a family dispute, a federal judge in Denver named Elias Morrison. I've been corresponding with him. He's agreed to review the case." The warden's eyebrows shot up. "You've been busy, Miss Moffat." A fierce, protective feeling swelled in Olita's chest. "I've been fighting for my husband's life and my property," she said, the words coming out before she could even think about them. "Your husband?" the warden asked, surprised. "We may not have had the official ceremony yet," Olita said firmly, her gaze unwavering. "But in every way that truly matters, Buford Kincheloe is my husband." Judge Elias Morrison arrived in Sweetwater 3 days later, and he did not come alone. He was accompanied by a stern-faced U.S. Marshal whose mere presence seemed to shift the balance of power in the entire territory. The arrival of a federal judge changed everything. Suddenly, the fear that had kept the town silent began to crack. Witnesses who had been too frightened to speak before began to come forward, telling stories of Hargrove's intimidation, of threats, of bribes. The U.S. Marshal, acting on the information from Callaway, found the three perjuring witnesses hiding out in Montana. Under the threat of federal charges for the bank robbery and a long prison sentence, they quickly confessed to everything, admitting that Victor Hargrove had paid them handsomely to lie on the stand. The conspiracy unraveled with breathtaking speed. Victor Hargrove was arrested for conspiracy, fraud, and witness tampering. His brother, Judge Lawrence Hargrove, was removed from the bench, facing a federal investigation for corruption and obstruction of justice. Claudel Hightower, the banker, was charged with conspiracy for his role in the illegal attempts to seize the Active K Ranch. But the most shocking revelation of all came when the U.S. Marshals searched the Hargrove Ranch. Hidden in Victor's safe, they didn't just find evidence of the frame-up. They found a small, dusty journal that had belonged to Sheriff Brennan's predecessor, a man who had died mysteriously in a hunting accident 12 years earlier. The journal was a bombshell. It detailed Victor Hargrove's early attempts to seize land for the coming railroad, and it contained the old sheriff's final chilling entry. A description of a meeting with Victor, where Hargrove had openly threatened him, revealing that Hargrove himself had murdered a railroad surveyor who had discovered the true, most profitable route, the one that ran through the Active K. The old sheriff had been killed the very next day. The cattle-rustling charge hadn't just been a frame-up to steal land. It had been a cover-up for murder. The entire affair, Judge Morrison explained to a packed, stunned courtroom, was a systematic and ruthless conspiracy to seize valuable land through bribery, violence, legal manipulation, and murder. Buford Kincheloe was not only exonerated, but he was granted a full and immediate pardon by the territorial governor. All charges against Alita were, of course, dropped. The vast Hargrove assets were seized by the federal government to pay damages to Buford and the other families they had wronged over the years. On a crisp, golden October morning, Buford Kincheloe walked out of the Wyoming Territorial Prison, a free man. Olita was there waiting for him, standing beside a wagon. She was no longer the uncertain, out-of-place Eastern woman who had stepped off the stagecoach months earlier. The prairie wind and the struggle for justice had transformed her, stripping away the fragile layers of her old life to reveal a core of unyielding steel. "Miss Moffett," he said, his voice thick with an emotion too deep for words as he closed the distance between them. "That's Mrs. Kincheloe to you," she corrected softly, a radiant smile spreading across her face. She produced a piece of paper from her pocket. It was a marriage certificate. "Judge Morrison performed the ceremony yesterday, by proxy. I hope you don't mind, but I decided I wasn't taking any more chances with our future." Buford stared at the certificate, then at her, and then he threw back his head and laughed. It was the first genuine, unrestrained sound of joy he had made in a year, a sound of pure, unadulterated freedom. "Mind?" he said, pulling her into his arms. "My dear Alita, I have never been happier about anything in my entire life." They were married again, properly this time, on the front porch of the rebuilt and restored Active K Ranch house. The entire town, it seemed, came to celebrate. Jeline Bister gave the bride away, and Rule Hollifield, his family's name finally cleared, stood as Buford's best man. As the sun set over the Wyoming prairie, casting the world in shades of orange and purple, Buford and Olita stood together on their land, looking out over the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. The long nightmare was finally over. "I came all this way to be a mail-order bride," Olita said softly, leaning her head on his shoulder. "And what are you now?" Buford asked, his arm holding her tight. She smiled, her hand resting on the worn leather of his vest, where the deed that had started it all was now safely kept. "I'm a rancher, I'm a fighter," she said. "I'm your wife." "You're all of that," he agreed, his voice full of love and awe. "But most of all, you're the woman who saved my life." The Active K prospered under their joint management. The railroad did come through, just as planned, making their land even more valuable and their future secure. They helped build a new town where the railroad crossed their property, a town with a school, a church, and a proper sheriff's office. And they named it Justice, as a permanent reminder that sometimes, even in the hardest and most unforgiving of places, the right thing can and does prevail. Alida Kingelo never once regretted answering that advertisement in the Philadelphia newspaper. She had arrived in the Wyoming Territory as a woman seeking simple security and companionship. She became a legend, the Eastern school teacher who took on the cattle barons, the corrupt bankers, and the crooked judges, and won. The woman who proved that true strength wasn't about the power you wielded over others, but about the courage and determination you find within yourself. She arrived a bride-to-be, but she became a pillar of the West. This story is a powerful reminder that true grit can change the world. If you were inspired by Alida's journey from a school teacher to a legend, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the incredible stories of justice and perseverance we have coming up next. Thanks for watching.